And while I'm happy to be here and glad at least a few of you took the opportunity to come, I would rather definitely be at the Olympics at the moment, despite the COVID situation that's prevented us from being there, but I'm sure we're all dealing in our own ways. So what I'm going to discuss a little bit this evening is kind of to give the broad terms of assessment, monitoring, and testing, and kind of move forward from that from a little bit of description of what it is, how it can be implemented, and what are some of the issues or concerns with doing so. I think one of the important things as a coach is that one of the main reasons that we want to assess, monitor, and test is that you manage what you measure. If you're measuring something, hopefully that means that you'll actually manage that and it'll become a major component of your implementing your training and programming. So first of all, to start off, what is it? Assessment, monitoring, and testing kind of ends up being used in synonymous terms for a lot of coaches. What I'm going to do is I use three very distinct ways of using those terms. And assessment, we typically use that to determine an athlete's ability to perform basic movements and find imbalances that may lead to chronic injury, as well as the general state and health of the athlete. So this is usually mostly health related, as well as some of the physical characteristics of the athlete, such as flexibility and the ability to perform certain movements that may or may not lead to potential injuries, especially chronic injuries. And especially in the national team setting, it's usually done by a health professional or IST, IST being integrated support team, whether that's physiotherapists, chiropractors, massage therapists, etc. They are hands-on with the athletes and doing very distinct tests and assessments, specifically assessments to determine some of those capabilities. Monitoring, we usually define as something we use to determine changes in health, the psychological state, performance readiness, and or adaptation to training. Again, usually recorded by the athlete, and then the coach will use their best knowledge to interpret what some of that recording hopefully means and how it pertains to the training. Excuse me. And then testing, typically used to determine the level of development of a specific athletic ability or performance factor at a specific point in time. And again, usually administered by the coach or performance support team. But again, in some environments, athletes may be doing that testing on their own once it's been suggested by the coach. Obviously not an ideal situation, but in some instances, that's the only option. So regarding monitoring, we basically have two measurements. One is a subjective measurement that we will use, and that's can be very simple, such as how are you feeling? Obviously, each day at practice, most coaches are usually asking athletes that, but we take it a step further and try to formalize that, and we'll get into some of those ways a little bit later in the presentation. But when we ask athletes how they're feeling, we're gaining some subjective information. And this is important because, as you know, athletes from day to day may feel tired, stressed, distracted. They may be sore, and they're may not likely to be able to perform their best ability that day in training. And it's behooves us to expect that an athlete is going to perform their best and at every single training session. The problem with the subjective information is that it's not able to tell us how physically ready to their body is to go for training. So that's one of the reasons why we rely a little bit as well on objective measurement. And objective data can include reactive strength index, heart rate variability, resting heart rate, and it can even be as things that are collected not by you as a coach, but say by part of your integrated support team, obviously at an elite level, such as saliva or blood sampling, or even hormonal and blood lactate responses to training. Basically, you're looking at trying to determine physical readiness. In the past, we've used when we were at National Training Center, we used the CSI in Calgary and the doctors and assessment folks there to do some of those measurements. If you only have one of those to do, if you don't have the ability of getting objective measurements, then most evidence points to the fact that subjective measurements are more accurate or reflect acute and chronic changes in training load more than objective measures. It's kind of a lagging response, so some of those things that you may or may not see in objective testing will show up sooner in the subjective measurement. At times, sometimes it's the reverse. Dr. Dave Smith in Calgary is very in tune with some of the things that we've done in that regard with some of our athletes. And usually with, for example, one athlete was typically when the athlete started complaining that they were tired, fatigued, etc. from the testing, we knew that we probably had anywhere between 5 to 7 days yet where we could push the athlete before they actually were at the state that they were describing. So some of that is a little bit of a lagging measure, but again, that's part of the art of it as opposed to the just the straight science of it. So again, in monitoring, numerous factors to consider, but the three main categories that we usually consider are fatigue, the general stress, and the readiness to train. Fatigue can be looked at many ways, and it's important to obtain an objective measure of muscular and central nervous system fatigue in order to better understand your athlete's physical readiness. Obviously, sleep duration and quality is a major factor in this, and is probably one of the most underutilized fatigue battlers by any athlete and coach, is that the amount of sleep an athlete gets is far less than what is optimal, for sure. Again, as Ian said, as you have any questions or any comments as we go through this, feel free to put those in the chat area. So again, general stress can be very taxing on the body and ultimately lead to impairments of focus, energy, recovery, and fatigue. Obviously, as coaches, we're intentionally putting stress onto our athletes because adaptations occur and improves performance. Unfortunately, we only have a limited control over the stress. As I put here, the 24-hour athlete. You, I always tell athletes, I, as a coach, only have the ability to have an impact for a few hours a day. Everything they do outside of that has an impact on what can happen in those few hours of training. Obviously, nutrition and health are one of those major components that come into play and creates a stress. Obviously, relationship stress, family stress, those kind of things. School is a big stress, and those things are obviously need to be taken into consideration when we're monitoring with athletes. Obviously, the readiness to train is made up of a combination of fatigue and stress, and can be defined many different ways, but should consider things such as how well the athlete appears to be moving, their level of focus and desire to train that day, as well as some objective data. And you'll see later on how we kind of track some of that. And obviously, monitoring readiness to train should consider comprehensive analysis of the athlete's well-being while analyzing their effects on the specific demands of the sport or daily training session. So again, stress and the fatigue are kind of combined to give you what we call the readiness to train, and that's one of the things that is fairly easily trackable. So how do we gather this data? So one of the most important things is you want to be able to interrupt the training as little as possible and make it convenient so that you've only got a certain amount of time with the athlete, which is limited. So you don't want to necessarily take up a lot of that with trying to gather that data. So having something that will allow them to do before or after, and possibly even during, but that again, potentially interrupts things. And I think it's important that we explain the importance of doing some of the gathering to the athletes so that they understand the process, that they're participating in it and buying into that, letting them know how beneficial it is, and that usually will help to build the adherence to filling out surveys or forms, et cetera, for the data collection. Obviously, asking athletes to take the survey at a regular scheduled time is most beneficial, because we get a kind of a standardized point at which that information is being collected. Usually with some of that, it's first thing in the morning, especially some of the objective data such as resting heart rate or heart rate variability. First thing in the morning is going to be when it's best taken if they're and a few minutes after they've been awake and lying there. If we do that later in the day, then other things become or can impact on that, such as when they've eaten, even their morning coffee, which can spike heart rate, etc. So trying to get athletes to do it as a consistent time. And again, part of that survey that we use, it's first thing in the morning, and then again right before training. Obviously, objective data can be more difficult to gather. And it's especially important in this that this data is taken in a fashion that, again, doesn't interfere with training, or as little as possible, and it's not going to cause fatigue. So obviously, if we did something like a max VO2 test before that day's training, that's going to have some impact on how well the training session goes for that day. So again, want to try and make it or build it into the training, or at certain times of year where it's not going to affect the athlete's training. And again, as I said, as you'll see, it's possible to incorporate some of these objective measures as part of the training, and as long as the conditions are consistent for monitoring purposes. So this is a sample of an athlete daily training log. This was back from the Stone Age when we used to use paper, and we've kind of moved from that. But again, just some of the items that we're looking at are the length of sleep, quality of sleep, their tiredness sensation, training willingness, appetite, competitive willingness, what their body weight is. And body weight is one of those things that's a touchy area to work with athletes, but if they understand that it's in relation to stress and fatigue and potential under-recovering, as opposed to we need you to be at a certain body weight, that it's just tracking to be able to see those changes, and it's as it's related to recovery. Again, resting heart rate variability, and HRV readiness, and then the stress level, enjoyment level, concentration level, and body fatigue and soreness. These are all what they will give a 1 to 10 to, excuse me. And then at post-practice, sense of accomplishment, whether the practice goals were met, and then some of the other modalities that they may have participated in that day. So then if we go forward, then this is kind of what, again, we've moved on from a little bit from the writing stone to electronic format, but this would be an example of what that form looked at. And it's still a feasible way to collect data if you don't have a digital means to do so. And again, this is another measure, which was just a daily sheet that's given to every athlete. And now we've done electronically, but this is, again, if you don't have electronic means, this is how each workout is given to an athlete, and then there's expectations that there will be things recorded on it that were pertinent to some of the technical or physical things that they were working on during that training session. This is what we've kind of moved on to. It's called athlete monitoring. And again, there's more opportunity for collecting data, which again means you have to manage that data, but it gives a much easier way for my athletes in particular to be able to do it. They log in on their phone. They actually can't get access, or typically can't get access to their workout until they've completed the parts of the questionnaire that are presented to them, which is in a format very similar to what the pages were that we just saw. And as well, assessments and health, I'm able to integrate with the with our Kelsey and the rest of our athletic team, and they're able to go in and put in things, whether the athletes saw them that day, what certain injuries were, where they are at their phase of recovery and rehabilitation, those kind of things. So it kind of gives a place where we can have all of that centered, and I receive any alerts, and that way we don't have to have athletes trying to explain to me what went on with an assessment that was done by our medical staff. It's all placed into this app for me, and it's a central location where I can go and have access to be able to track everything. And it sends me a report every day to kind of track if there was anything untoward in some of the surveys. So for example, if an athlete was reported a certain number that's kind of out of a range that we would expect for them, then it alerts me. I may need to talk to them at day, see what was up. Perhaps there was more stress. There was, they were feeling a lot more fatigued than what we could visually see, et cetera. And so that all, as I said, is collected in one place and allows me to track that information fairly succinctly. Excuse me. So this is an example of one of the readouts that I can get from that. And this is the heart rate variability versus resting heart rate versus subjective training readiness. And you can see that it fairly closely all three factors kind of follow each other, and goes back to the comment we made earlier that if you only have one thing to be able to measure, then the subjective readings can obviously be all that you use. You don't have to necessarily have, for example, HRV or resting heart rate to be able to determine that their readiness, their training readiness is decreased at the moment. So I think that was one of the important things that we're learning, is that a lot of the subjective data that we're getting actually kind of reflects what's happening in the objective way, which is obviously helpful for coaches, especially if you don't have access to those kind of things. Excuse me. So testing obviously can be done in the field, or it can be done in a lab. Obviously, I've just got a few that are most people are probably familiar with and listed here. Obviously, a VO2 max test performed typically in a lab, although now a new company out of Kelowna allows you to be able to do VO2 max tests in the field. They have a VO2 max test, or a mask that actually does all of the readings and relays it to a app on your phone, so they're able to wear a VO2 max mask, and as well as do anaerobic threshold testing literally in the field. So they can wear a VO2 max mask during training and get data that way during the actual training session. Same with lactate threshold. Typically has been performed in a lab, but again, technology is such that now we're able to do some of that. We personally don't do any, but some of the athletes that I work with on the national team, they're doing lactate threshold testing almost, in a sense, every training session where they're doing lactate work. The beep test, obviously most people are familiar with that. Standing long jump and max strength tests all can be performed pretty much in either a field or in a lab. Results from testing can indicate the level of development of an athletic ability or performance factor at a specific point in time, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's what it's indicating, and we'll get into some of that later on in time. But I think it's important to realize that that's all it is a snapshot in time. Tomorrow the athlete may perform very differently. The athlete may perform very differently the day before. There is that possibility that that's not going to be replicated the next day, or so on. The key is obviously trying to get to the point where that would be, but again, it's very very much a snapshot of that moment in time. Obviously, the results can assist coaches in adapting the training program. We use specifically, especially with our throwers, testing pretty much every single day, and that's what leads the training program. It's easy in our sport or in individual sports to be able to do that, where you can literally be doing testing in a sense just by what they're performing each day in their program. There's some drills or that literally end up being tests and are tracked every single day. So again, another thing that testing can do is assist in motivating athletes. It can also work the other way because it can be discouraging. In our program, it takes at least a year, perhaps even 2. Sometimes the athlete will look at it and see that they're not improving, but they need to realize that that's expected during certain points in training where we're doing a specific load and we're looking at the adaptation curve of each athlete, and that kind of as I said, takes a little bit of buy-in from the athlete, and usually takes at least a year in the program before they trust and rely that if they're involved in doing everything they can, that improvement will come, and that that's just one indication of improvement, that testing isn't always the be-all and end-all. Obviously, can help indicate progress in relation to goals, as I previously mentioned, and then used to assist in determining if present training cycle has been effective. If we're aiming at something specific that's being developed during that training cycle, then we will want to be able to assure that that's happened. And sometimes it doesn't. I mean, in training, a lot of times you'll have, I've had many training cycles over the years where you're expecting one thing to come out of the training and you don't actually get that. And that's a little bit beyond the scope of this, but that kind of comes into the periodization of training, where you're continually trying to develop the athlete's abilities. And sometimes you just don't get the response that you want. So testing can help you determine if it's been effective. I'm just seeing here that Liam's got a question. Yeah. Liam, how about if I send you the information afterwards, if you can send the email and stuff, because I actually, off the top of my head, I don't remember the name of the company. But it's proprietary software that they're using that links to the smartphone. I think it's called VO2 Master. VO2 Master. Even if you Googled that, but if you don't find that, let me know, and I will certainly send you the link for the information. So obviously there are some limitations regarding tests. And they really are just indicators. They're not necessarily predictors. Obviously, even for example, something like swimming, if we were to take and have a swimmer do 50 free as a test in training, and they have a really good time, obviously that should be the closest predictor to performance as you can get. Same with almost any individual event. If they're performing well in those tests during training, you should be able to predict that they're doing well. But again, it's a moment in time snapshot, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you will be able to see that a few days out when you have the athlete perform at a meet or a competition and expecting those same results. And that's where the experience and years of data will help you determine post competition what the things that led to having a good test, but not necessarily a good performance. And some of those things are not necessarily evident sometimes, but the more things that you track, hopefully the more you are able to predict what's going to happen. But again, it is just an indicator. It's not necessarily a predictor. Obviously, again, you want to consider test results in light of other information, such as the skill level of the athlete, the training age of the athlete, as an example, as opposed to just, and even just the age, the developmental age of the athlete, the phase of training or the training load, the fatigue, lack of sleep, et cetera. Those may all come into play and are often things that are outside of your control as a coach when it comes to actually having a test take place. So again, this just kind of reaffirms what I was saying, is that sometimes the test is just a measure of the test itself. Improvement in a test does not necessarily mean that you're going to get improvement in the sports movement, the skills, the specific skill, or even the specific fitness that you're looking for. And you may not get, you know, from test to test any differences. And those are some of the things that you need to look at. One, is your test a valid test? Is it an effective test? Is it something that's testing what you actually want to test? And we'll get into some of those as we go forward here. And obviously the test should augment the information a coach has from competitive results and the day-to-day training sessions, as well as the logs that you're keeping, or hopefully keeping with the athletes, excuse me, so that you're being able to determine, hopefully, some of the things that may be able to contribute to that. And thanks for finding that, Ian, the vo2master.com. So again, choosing the effectiveness of tests, it should be relevant to the athlete's sport and perhaps even to their event and or position within that sport, and as specific as it possibly can be. So the more specific you can make that test to what they actually have to perform within their sport, then you're going to be able to get better results. Obviously, if you want to know effectiveness of someone as a free throw shooter, you're not going to test them by having them shoot 3-pointers. I mean, that's a very obvious one, but there are things that people do fairly regularly, and I hate to pick on football, but football is one of the ones that continually boggles my mind by implementing tests in their combine that are essentially meaningless to their sport. One of the prime ones that comes to my mind is doing a 100-kilo bench press and seeing how many times they can do it. And if someone can do 85 times, I'm being a little bit facetious here, but if they can rep that out for 85 repetitions, what does that actually have to do with their sport or event or position? So you're, whereas, you know, the 40-yard test, obviously a little bit more pertinent to what they do within their sport itself. So you want to make sure that the procedures are standardized, and they're repeatable and reliable. So you're always trying to do it at the same time, perhaps, same time of day, same time during your periodization or cycle of your training. Obviously, training at the end of a training cycle or a training session is going to give you very different results than if you got your athletes to test at the beginning of that, where they're of that same cycle, where they're fresh and ready to go. You're going to find that there's very different results, and it's going to be probably not as reliable as what you were hoping. Now, having said that, there are some tests that you can perform and do during that time to see how the fatigue is related to the training itself. And again, measure what they're supposed to, or so that they're valid results. So if you're trying to measure anaerobic power, you're not doing a VO2 max test to do it. I mean, that seems fairly obvious, but there are some nuances with some of the tests. And the beep test is one of those tests that I pick on all the time, that I think a lot of people are looking for something out of that test that it really doesn't necessarily actually test. Again, hopefully you have data to compare results to, for example, scoring tables or normative tables, something that, especially in individual sports, there's tons of information out there about both obscure as well as well-known, repeatable norms that, say, for example, a javelin thrower men will often use a 1 kilo ball and do testing from a standing throw from 3 steps, from 5 steps, etc., and use that. Obviously, it's very similar to the movement itself of throwing javelin, and the Finns are notorious for having incredibly detailed norms that you can use to then obviously compare, although as I will mention later, it's comparing can be a dangerous thing, but for you as a coach, we'll give you a kind of a synopsis of where they are, and that gets a little bit more into the talent ID and recruitment side of things, as far as looking at some of those tests and seeing what potential, although I hate to use the word potential, the athlete has. And again, tests should be conducted fairly typically at regular intervals, so that it's not way too long between tests, so that you've the information is outdated and not really going to be applicable, especially depending on if you're implementing it into your training program, so that you're it's giving you as close to that point in time where you want to know the information from. And again, hopefully you're properly interpreting, and again, it's a snapshot in time. It's not necessarily a predictor, but you want to be able to use all the other information that you have at hand for interpreting your results for your own needs, as well as being able to have answers for the athletes as well. Excuse me. So I'm just going to go through a few examples of ways that this is put into our training program, and this is not used with all athletes, but obviously with some of our speed, power, and strength athletes, we will use velocity-based training as an example of how we're testing almost daily. And it's not seen as a test, it's just the fact that they're doing the exercise and we're recording it while it's being done. So in this instance, we're talking about being in the weight room and using devices to be able to measure absolute strength, accelerative strength, strength, speed, speed strength, and starting strength. I'm not going to go into all of the details on what each of those mean, but suffice it to say, each of those things are being measured, and they don't have to focus then on trying to put as many plates on each side. And especially with males in the weight room, there's a lot of ego that happens, and you have guys trying to stack on as much as possible and each and every day, when instead this gives a way of making sure that they're within a training zone that you want them to be in, and it kind of prevents some of that from happening and creating some of the chaos that comes with that. So how we've done that is there's an app called Iron Path, and you can just simply take video, and it will actually be able to, from that, determine meters per second in velocity. And it's a free app, and at least I think it still is. I haven't used Iron Path for a while, but when we were in locations, so for example, I think this was in Korea, we were able to use it when we didn't travel with some of the other devices that we were using. Again, another one that's being used fairly regularly is the push device. It's we have 4 of them that we use, and it can be put on either the bar as an accelerometer or on the individual's arm to determine the movements. You have to dial in which movement is being used and then use it. We also use it for reactive tests at the beginning of practice to determine athlete readiness, and it's not as accurate as the next device that we also have that we use, but it's as far as getting the same result, but it's wrong on the same measure, if you were. Let's say if, for example, if we were talking about meters per second, the GymAware, which I'm going to talk about in a few moments, will measure 0.1 meters per second, and this measures 0.12 meters per second. It's repeatable. So it may not be as accurate, but the repeatability is such that you can rely on it. You just don't want to use to compare between the 2 devices. So that is the one benefit of using the push devices. It's much easier, it's much cheaper, and it's can still get the same data from it. It just has to be interpreted just a little bit differently. So here is the gym aware, and an athlete will basically, this is a screenshot from an iPad that sits on a magnet on, let's say, for example, the squat rack, and they can come in and choose themselves. This one, for example, has Ryan Summer, and it's set up. It will have his body mass already in here. So some of the power measurements are calculated immediately. And then there's targets that will give them feedback when they're doing the lift. And if they are in the target, it beeps at them. So they're getting immediate feedback, which is one of the most important things, obviously, in athletics, is getting immediate feedback for change to be able to take place. And again, this is just a sample of the graph that comes up after, once they've completed, so the athlete themselves can see if they were in zone or not, and how it progressed through the actual lift itself. And then this is another version of it, and as you can see in this one, from the beginning to the end, the peak velocity was getting lower, which you would expect with fatigue as they were going through that. Again, another way of tracking we'll continually use is, again, height, angle, and velocity of release. This is, in particular, is in hammer. A little bit more cumbersome to do, but it is actually not too bad as long as you have an iPhone or an iPad set up in a constant location and you have something for reference. And down below, you will note that where it says 1.85, there's actually a little bit of a device that's on the floor that just gives us a consistent measuring for each time. So as long as we have something in the frame that gives a consistent reference, then you're able to use it. But otherwise, it's fairly simple to use and use on a daily basis. Not used on a daily basis, but at certain times during the training season. Again, another one, using GPS devices, which are commonly being used now in things like soccer, to be able to track individuals, how much they're running, moving, their accelerative speeds, etc. We've also used it for modeling limb velocities and testing in that manner as well. And again, just back to individual daily testing. This is a graph of the individual results beginning of 25 training sessions, just over 2 weeks. So this is, for the most part, 2 training sessions per day. And the tracking of distance of a thrower, in this case, Heather Stacy, over those 25 sessions leading up to national championships in 2011, where she won Canadian national championships on her way to the world championships. And this is just, as I said, a record of each of those, the best throw taken during that session on each one of the days. It's also recorded which part of the series it was taken on, and we will track it that way as well. So these are just some of the ways in which you can get fairly detailed, and I think one of the successes of our program is the ability to use a lot of data on individual athletes to be able to help athletes peak at a time when they need to. Again, should we do it? It's always a quandary for coaches to do testing. Some coaches will do it fairly regularly, some will do it intermittently. And I think we need to keep in mind that doing it daily and consistent and ongoing is important. And using testing within your YTP or your yearly training plan, I think, is essential to the changing training stimulus. I think this is important even when we're talking about high school athletes, and using something like the log sheet that I was referring to earlier, or showing examples of. It's amazing how much you can pick up from something like that to be able to determine whether you should be changing your training and your training blocks or cycles. And this is just as much relevant to team sports as it is individual sports. Obviously, it's also helpful for determining the general ongoing health of the athlete if you're monitoring. Sometimes there are flags that will pop up to be able to recognize that an athlete is under recovering. Obviously, stress levels going higher, the sleep patterns getting less and less, the quality of sleep that they're recording is less and less. That's a potential for a disaster when it comes to potential injuries and how an athlete's going to perform both in training as well as in competition. And again, it helps to determine whether there's been training adaptation, and otherwise, how else do you know if there's been training adaptation? And I think it's, as coaches, we always like to think that our programs are bulletproof and that they're going to create the response that we're looking for. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. And it's not always your fault, but it's not always the athlete's fault as either. Can be a combination of the two. Athletes, obviously, as I said, you only have control over a few hours of the day. They have all the rest of the day to make things go bust or make it go well. So I think it's important to be able to have that kind of data to be able to, not only for your own self, but to be able to go back and show the athlete that this is where things were potentially going to lead to injuries when those situations that I talked about where the stress is high, sleep was low, and sleep quality was low. I think it's beneficial to be able to point directly to that athlete and show them that that was the case. If you didn't have that data and the athlete comes to you and says, "Oh, I don't understand, but I was sleeping," because our memories are very short and athletes always think that they're doing everything they need to be. You're able to have something concrete to show them. And I think that can be an important factor in getting buy-in from athletes. And obviously, we use it as a key indicator in determining performance readiness. And obviously, in a lot of cases at the elite level and below, there's international modeling that you can go to determine gap analysis. Here's where you are, here's where you need to be. These are some of the things that we need to be able to do in order to get to that point. And again, as I said, you manage what you measure. If you're measuring things, hopefully that means that you have the data and you'll actually do something with it and put it to use and move forward with it. So again, this is just most of you have probably seen an example of a YTP or yearly training plan if you've gone through any of the coach certification. And I think it's important that that's administered and built into your training plan when you're going to do testing, as well as this is just a outline or a guide for the year. And hopefully that training monitoring, and will help you lead to better decisions as to what you change. This is not something you just stick to, it's an outline, and that will help guide you and make the changes to this as you move along. Just moving on to some safety and etiquette. Obviously, you want to, if you're working with younger children, you should probably be obtaining consent from parents of young athletes, letting them know that you're going to be doing testing and or some of those surveys. Obviously, data in this day and age can be a touchy thing for individuals, as I said, especially with things like body weight, and those can be sensitive areas. So you definitely want to be obtaining consent from parents of young athletes and letting them know why you're keeping that data and have them consent to it. Obviously, make sure all equipment is safe and appropriate for the athletes to use. Making sure that the athletes are warmed up. And in fact, we will try to have the exact same warm up, not just in training, but as well on the days where we're having testing. And then that way the warm up itself isn't becoming part of a restriction or limitation of the test itself. Obviously, you want to be positive and encouraging. Athletes can have very sensitive egos or self-esteem that can be problematic if they're not testing the way that they were hoping to. And we obviously need to deal with that on an individual basis with each athlete, and trying to be positive and encouraging, and give them you know, realistic answers as to why perhaps testing isn't going the way that they would like to. Obviously, explaining why the testing is occurring and what it will measure and how the results will be used. I think that's important to let athletes know. Sometimes, especially at the university level, I'm not the best at always getting that through to them, why it's occurring, and obviously a lot of times they'll know what it's measuring. They aren't necessarily aware of what the results will be used for, especially in their first year, until we've had some of those conversations about what we're using it for, why it's occurring, and how it's beneficial to changing their training program throughout the year. And as I said, you may want to consider keeping the results confidential. In fact, depending on what the tests are, I think it's wise to, and not just the testing results, but the monitoring results, to keep confidential. Again, I keep going back to body weight, but I think that's one of the important ones as far as keeping that under your hat and not sharing with anyone and everyone. Some coaches do believe in publishing the results of all of the tests, and I think that's, depending on what the tests are, I think that can build team camaraderie, as well as a lot of competitiveness within the athletes to better themselves as well as against each other. Again, in controlled situations. And you want to ensure that athletes aren't just looking at that comparison, but they're also looking at how they're improving, and hopefully improving as we go. And again, answering all questions that athletes and parents have. I think it's important to be able to say why we're doing anything that we are, whether that's in training, in testing, or why we're monitoring something. I think, and that's one of the things that I tell my athletes all the time, is that if I can't tell you why we're doing something in training, then perhaps we probably shouldn't be doing it. And I think that that's an important thing to be able to convey to athletes and parents. Excuse me. So some final considerations with testing and monitoring. Different sports and even different positions within a sport require different strength, speed, or energy system qualities. And obviously testing and monitoring can track this progress, as well as you can use that information for changing what you're doing in your training, or keeping some of those things in your training. Obviously, as a football player will require more strength than a tennis player, but that doesn't mean that the tennis player shouldn't improve his or her maximum strength. You want to identify the requirements of the athlete's sport and position through a needs analysis, and then program and plan accordingly while monitoring and testing. And I think that's the important thing to note, is that not just even within the sport, say between a tennis player and a football player, but between positions and between individuals. You may have certain expectations of one athlete within a position as compared to another one that's, has a different training age, has a different developmental age, and their involvement in the sport has been different than each other. So I think it's important to not do too much comparing between individuals when it comes to some of those items. Excuse me. Then a gap analysis and needs assessment are essential prerequisites for developing a yearly training plan, and monitoring and testing can help with some of these uncertainties. So you want to be able to say, here's where we are, here's where we need to go, here's some of the things that we are going to test and monitor to be able to show us that we're on track, or steer us back on track if we get off track. As I said before, there's a lot of things that you will do in training sessions that despite your best ability is not going to elicit the response you want at that time. And a lot of those may be related to something you've done in training 6-8 weeks beforehand, that it's a lagging factor, and experience and some of that data collection hopefully will help you with determining some of that. And obviously monitoring and testing is essential for pushing the envelope of high performance, and injuries and plateaus are inevitable otherwise. If you just keep pushing and pushing with an athlete and you don't have something that's helping you to monitor what's happening in the training, inevitably you're going to have those plateaus, and in the worst case scenario, you're going to have injuries. And obviously the critical thinking is always asking yourself, not just your athletes, parents, or friends and family, asking why is something being done, but you should be asking yourself, why is this being done? And what is the adaptation goal, and how do I know what's working? And obviously monitoring and testing can help to determine its effectiveness. As I said before, it's not a be all and end all. There are some constraints to that, but it's at least one of the tools that helps you to down that road of effectiveness. And obviously educated experimentation. As coaches, we are always trying to change the way that we're doing things, and hopefully for the better, but we don't know if it's leading to better results if we're not monitoring or testing and moving in that direction. Excuse me. So on that note, if there's any questions or discussion, again, I know it's sometimes a little bit difficult in situations like this where you can't see and can't hear everything, but definitely if you have any questions or comments, please let us know.
Thanks, Larry. We'll wait a couple minutes to see if there's any questions pop in the chat. While we do that, just next week we have our session 8 of 10, and we will welcome University of Lethbridge professor Dr. Scott Rathwell to present, and he will present how to create winning habits.
Yeah, one of the things I forgot to mention in the beginning, obviously, is I had asked Ian to send out a form that hopefully got people thinking a little bit about, or some questions along in the form, thinking about some of the things that, how they go through. So hopefully it provides at least a bit of little material to guide you through a little bit of a self-reflection process. Jamie, you have a question. You could probably turn on your mic if you want.
You guys hear me?
Yes.
Larry, I just kind of want to bring it back to minor sports a little bit. I know when we're testing our university athletes, we have a pretty good idea their day-to-day. We're with them roughly 4 hours a day. We're on them all the time to get the proper sleep, the proper nutrition, things like that. But when we're dealing with minor athletes, we'll say in a team sport atmosphere, when we really don't know what they're doing, we don't know what they're doing at school, we don't know what they're doing at home, we don't know what time they're going to bed. How hard is it, or is it even worthwhile to even consider testing measures with athletes that you really have an arm's length relationship with, rather than those athletes that you are with every single day and you kind of know their ins and out every single day?
Yeah, I think that becomes a tough thing to determine, and I think we've had conversations around this a few times, and that I still think it's worthwhile to pursue some of the things just to get even just a baseline from where they are. And I think that's where it becomes important, as you say, to be observant and present on a day-to-day basis. But perhaps, relying on a lot of those subjective questions. How are you feeling today? Are you feeling like, excuse me, are you, how was your sleep last night? They may not have something that you're putting it down, because I know you're probably talking with some of the really young kids that you're working with. And I think that that's still behooves us not to at least kind of get a little bit of a look or a little bit of a picture into how the athlete is simply feeling that day. I mean, they just may have had a bad day at school and just aren't feeling it when they come to a training session, or they spent all day at the beach, before coming to Little League practice that day or something. And I think that gives you, you know, the ability to then set expectations for that session with those athletes and what you're going to kind of see with those athletes. And I think, as I said, it gets a little bit more difficult that way, but I still think it's worth, for sure, at least having some of the subjective things asked of the athletes. You'd be surprised how many, or maybe you won't be surprised, Jamie, how many 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds will tell you exactly how they're feeling that day, and you'll get a pretty good idea from that what to expect that day. And again, is it really important as far as from a recruitment perspective? I'm going to leave that to some of the Little League coaches, but I would say that we're probably not going to get a whole lot out of that. I mean, I think all of us as coaches have seen kids who have done phenomenal as young kids, and then parents and or coaches having expectation this kid's going to be the next Wayne Gretzky, et cetera, and it doesn't pan out. That happens all the time, I think, in sport, and especially these days with a lot more specialization going on. Again, getting a little bit beyond the topic of our conversation, but I think it's pretty evident that something that happens at that young age isn't necessarily going to be a predictor, but it gives us, again, as I said, a snapshot in time. I'm not sure if that kind of answers your question or not, Gina.
Yeah, that's good, Larry. Thank you.
Okay, we just have one comment left, Larry. I don't know if you have read that one, but just a comment that it was received, and obviously the information and handout was well received from the participants. So looks like that is all for tonight. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us tonight. Larry, thank you very much for your presentation. Guys. And again, next week we will welcome University of Lethbridge professor Dr. Scott Rathwell and How to Create Winning Habits.